Hello and welcome to the Kevin Mannix Report. I'm Kevin Mannix, the host for this show, and this is a show that's designed to give all of us a little bit of insight and information about what goes on in Oregon, in and about government. We have a guest today, a gentleman who's our guest today is someone who's so involved in state government that I don't really quite know how to describe him other than as the majority leader of the House of Representatives. It's Steve Harper, and he's from Southern Oregon, and I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here.
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm in awe of you, but in a way, the majority leader is a key player in the political process. And we'll talk more about that as we go down into the show a little bit. But one of the things we do try to do on this show is to get a little background information. What are people really all about, so that viewers don't just see talking heads, but they know there's some real people here. Can you tell us a little bit about where you come from and you know, where you grew up, that sort of thing?
Yes, I hate ties.
You're going to start by explaining that you're not wearing your uniform
No,
today.
you're going to explain. You're supposed to explain before we get further.
All right. Well, you're not wearing a coat and tie today because we're producing this show as of Oregon's 140th birthday, admission into statehood, and a number of us are supposed to be wearing Western wear at the Capitol. And I dragooned you into service, but you had your Western wear on.
Yes, and thank you very much.
So tell us now a little bit about yourself as a Western wearer and all of that.
Well, as you say, Kevin, from Klamath Falls, the southern part of the state. We moved there in 1984. I'm a career military officer, 30 years in the Air Force and the Oregon Air National Guard. We moved here from Washington, D.C. to go to work at the new Guard base at Kingsley Field in Klamath. That's how we started.
Now, let's take you back a step here. You mentioned 30 years in the Air Force. Was this something that you always wanted to do when you were growing up, was get into the Air Force, or how'd that happen?
Basically, from my earliest memories, I used to look up and see airplanes go overhead, and I thought that's what I should do.
Did you come in just after the Korean War, or were you in during that time? You mentioned 30 years. I would say it must have been the mid-50s or later 50s that you got involved?
Mid-60s. You're off by a decade.
Oh. Well, you stayed
okay.
until the 90s, and I should just deduct 30 from that, get into the 60s.
I have a long memory. I'll remember that one.
Well, how was your service in the Air Force? Did you travel around? Were you stationed in a variety of places?
Yeah, you know, all the military is very similar. Probably about your first 5 or 6 years, you're undergoing training. You go here for 6 months, there for 8 months, here for 6 weeks. So in the first 5 or 6 years, you probably move 10 or 12 times. After that, it kind of slows down, but that's what you do. That's how you get started.
Now, when you ended up in Klamath Falls at Kingsley Field, was there something special about the community that made you want to stay there, or is it because you happened to be there? What was your reasoning for staying on?
Well, we moved there in '84, and the big kid was 10 years old, and the little kid was 3, and out of the 4, and the other 2 were in between. But they essentially grew up there. I retired in September of '93. You know, spent 9 years there at the Oregon Air Guard base, and they grew up there. And Klamath Falls is a place where you would probably take your family and move to if you're in a situation, because it's that kind of a community, that kind of town. And we lived there. And, you know, if I'd have gotten a job anyplace else in the country, I'd have probably gone by myself. So we decided to stay there after I retired.
And you adopted it as a place you wanted to be for your home.
That is absolutely correct. Or it adopted us, however you want to do it.
Now, you were a fighter jockey?
That's correct.
You ended up as a colonel, or a lieutenant colonel, or a full colonel in the Air Force?
Colonel, yeah.
And you were commander of the Kingsley Field operation.
Right.
And now, how can a fellow with that kind of background shift into the world of politics? There's quite a transition.
Tequila.
Tell me about it.
No. In the Air Force, you move around quite a bit. In the military, you move around quite a bit. I'd really never been in any one place long enough to get involved in the community. As the commander of the base, a significant economic portion of Klamath County, I just by definition got involved. I was Rotarian and joined this and joined that and did this, United Way, Chamber of Commerce, things like that. So I got really involved in community activities, and because I'd never had a chance to do that before. And after we retired, I took a job as the director of the Chamber of Commerce, Klamath County Chamber of Commerce, and was doing that when I got recruited, just simple recruitment.
Well, you seem to be pretty relaxed about your entry into politics. A lot of folks get into it and they seem to be all revved up, having to do this, having to do that. Did you come into this with any particular kind of philosophy or vision or view, or is it mainly, hey, I'm here coming from the community, trying to do the right thing, generally speaking, and then let's see what needs to be done?
Well, that's the view. That's the value system, Kevin, and that's the passion. Taking this as really a simple extension of community service. I bring, trying to help my community up in the state legislature. That's really all it is. It's really nothing more than that.
Now, in your experience as a legislator, this is your third term?
Second term.
Remember, I skipped a beat
That's
here,
right,
so I have
yeah.
to get myself back into having missed a session. You're in your second term, so you'd be able to come back under term limits for one more term in the House.
Mm-hmm.
What are your impressions this time around compared to the 95 session, which, let's see, wait a minute, 97 was your
session.
first.
Yeah.
97 would have been your first time around. What's your impression this time around?
Well, I am working very hard to make the system a little more simplistic, if you will, a little more structured, where people have a little clearer understanding of where they fit in the process, how the process works and how it doesn't work. Because with term limits, the most experience we'll have there in the House is a 6-year person. So I think it's very, very important that we have a system in place that people understand they can get into fairly quickly. So, I think this session is a little more structured because of the work that we did in the previous 18 months getting ready for this session. And I just see that just getting better and better as we go along.
Now, I should mention, you're the majority leader of the House. Now, the majority is the Republicans, the minority would be the Democrats. That's the way we set up the opposing forces in politics.
That's the natural order of things.
Well, I'll remember that, too. Now, from that perspective, you might let folks know what the majority leader's job basically is all about, as opposed to speaker or committee chair and that kind of thing.
Very simple job. It's herding cats. You have 34 cats running in every different direction. You've got to get them going the same way, same day. It's quite exciting sometimes when you have members such as Representative Mannix to herd on occasion.
Well, I just get off on the edge of that herd of cats. You've got to make sure that they're pulling together and coalescing around some basic issues.
Yeah, we set up, spent a lot of effort in trying to develop an agenda of stuff that's important to our core values as Republicans. And that agenda translates into bills and measures, and we want to get those, through the system, through the process, passed, and have the governor sign them. That's our goal. And trying to get that all done falls in our office.
Well, this time around in the 99 session, you've got 34 Republicans, 1 independent, and then 25 Democrats in the House. There's also a Republican majority in the Senate. And of course, the name of the game is you have to get a bill through both the House and the Senate. Do you work with your colleague, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Gene Derfler, on trying to move this agenda, or how does that work?
We spend more time together than he spends with his wife. And he lives here in Salem, as you well know. We spend an awful lot of time together just for that reason. And the Speaker spends a lot of time with the Senate President, and we're all doing this together. For the first 3 weeks of the session, we were together 15, 18 hours a week trying to coordinate activities to make sure that what we are getting done would get done, to make sure we had a consistent story, consistent theme, those kind of things. So, an awful lot of time. That's what it takes.
Now, in working together like that, my impression is, and I was an outsider in the 97 session, my impression is that that's quite a shift, that the last time around there wasn't quite as much communication. I don't care who's at fault or whatever else, but it's just, objectively speaking, it seems that there's been a change. Is that the case?
Well, that's my sense. The last session I wasn't a part of leadership, but that's my sense. And just looking at it from, from my perspective, just as a freshman legislator, that seemed to be one of the things that we were constantly battling.
Now, what about the relationship with the governor? Any bill that passes has got to be signed by the governor, or if he vetoes it, it takes 2/3 of the House and Senate to do an override. Are you finding friction there at this point, or are the forces of accommodation at work here? Where my impression is that there's a bit more communication this time from the governor's office, more of a heads up about their concerns about bills, rather than the stony-faced silence, which then afterwards is followed by a veto that people didn't expect. But that doesn't seem to be quite the trend this time. But what's your impression?
I think your impression of much better communication, much more of it. We formally meet each Monday for about an hour, formally and informally as the need arises. And that will take place much more often in the next couple of months for specific bills or just a general how are things going. Much better coordination. Very relaxed. Governor is a wonderful person. Just has some politics that, you know, perhaps we disagree with on occasion. But you need to remember, or the people need to remember, it takes 31 House members, 16 Senate members, and the governor to make a bill into a law. So all of us have to work together to make this thing into statute.
Well, in fact, that's one factor that some people seem to ignore when they demand this or that or the other. And you may get the votes in the House, you may get the votes in the Senate, but then you better get the governor's agreement too.
You got to have all three, because we'll not, if he vetoes a bill, we'll not be able to override it. That's just as a practical matter.
Does that cause you then to focus on the positive things that can be accomplished rather than the symbolism of things that can't be accomplished and sending messages and that sort of thing?
I would think, by and large, we'll still send a message when it's appropriate or when we think it's necessary. But 95% of the stuff, or 99% of the stuff we do, Kevin, will be trying to get the best thing done for the most amount of people and the least amount of cost, whatever that turns out to be. I'd say all three of those bodies, 48 people, have to think it's a pretty good idea. That's just, as a practical matter, that's how business is done.
In fact, we need
Makes you crazy sometimes, but that's what you're living with. Yeah.
Well, we need to remind folks, too, that I was reading an editorial comment at a newspaper where they're saying maybe we should have a unicameral legislature because this way we can get more bills passed. And my immediate reaction was, well, wait a minute. No, they don't get it. The reason we have a bicameral legislature was to make it hard to get bills passed, that we didn't want government having such an easy time of changing our laws or adding more restrictions on our lives, that in fact we set up a system of checks and balances not only between the executive and the legislative, but within the legislative branch. And some folks seem to overlook that a bit sometimes, and the goal isn't just to pass laws unless you can make the case that they're going to improve our society. Now, as you're dealing with those issues, do you get involved with the committee chairs and their agendas, or the members themselves and trying to focus on what they're doing? What kind of interaction do you work out?
Well, for instance, let me back up to the unicameral. The colonel in me thinks that's a great idea. But as a practical matter, we do need those checks and balances. And as a practical matter, less laws generally is better, from my perspective. But the majority leader and the committee chairs, we talked about the agenda-setting session of which we all attended. We have a handful of things that are high priority. We sit down, we have been communicating with the committee chairs to develop a timeline. When it comes out of the House, when it comes out of the Senate, when you'll have a hearing, anticipated measure to the floor, when it goes to the other body. And we've got these things stretched out until governor signs over here. Introduction here, governor signing over here. And we're tracking that on a daily basis. So we're in communications. Our office is in communication with the committee chairs every day to make sure that those things are happening in that order. If not, we need to go fix it.
Let me pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on the Kevin Mannix Report. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Kevin Mannix Report, 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301. If you want, you can also call and leave a message at 503-364-1913. That's in Salem again. It's 503-364-1913, and we're always happy to hear from you. Our guest today is Colonel Steve Harper. I should now say Majority Leader Steve Harper, or Representative Steve Harper, best known as
Hey
just
you.
plain Steve, or Hey You, the House Majority Leader. And we were talking a little about the unicameral legislature and all of that process. You were talking then about agenda setting, working with the chairs, which makes me think a bit more about the committee structure in the legislature. A lot of folks may not understand that we don't just take bills down to the floor of the House and pass them. Can you mention for a moment how this committee structure works when we're processing a bill?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road. You get an idea. The idea goes to the lawyers. They put it in terms that nobody can understand, and it gets sent to the committees, and they are basically functional. Public safety, judicial, environment, water, ag, transportation. That legislature set up by committees by functional area. That bill goes to that committee chair and committee administrator, and they deal with it down there at their level. I think the thing that we seem to forget is they get their hands on about 3 or 4 times as many bills as actually make it out. Enormous amount of bills are just ideas that really never get very far in the process. If the committee chair decides that it's, and with the help of his committee decide that it is appropriate, they'll have a hearing. And they really are the ones that do it all. The majority leader, we're a process. Is that bill being heard? Not necessarily what's in it, whether it's good or bad, but is it being heard, and where is it in the queue?
So when someone's following a bill, they want to make sure something's really happening. The action place is the committee.
Committee chairs, committee members, absolutely. That's where it is.
And in that action frame, or that situation, people also need to realize that the agenda just can go so far, and you can cover just so much mileage in any given session. So a lot of things end up not being heard, or if they're heard, not acted upon. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's bad. I mean, because there's a lot of bad ideas or ideas that still need more gestation time.
Well, that's where you say you only see a fourth of the bills that get presented ever make it out, just because of this culling process. We've got we have kind of this culture that we're trying to change. I don't know how successful it'll be, but the measure of success is not how many. It's not a number. It's not a quantity measure. It's a quality measure. If you put in 2 bills and they both pass, they're both good bills and they both pass, to me that's better than putting in 20 bills and having none of them pass. So I think a quality issue I think we need to take a look at. How you change that culture, I don't know, because the general population seems to think that numbers mean something. I just have a little bit different viewpoint.
Well, for instance, the newspapers who run the, as I've seen in the past, I haven't seen it this session so far, what day of the session it is, and how many bills have passed as of that day, as though that's the progress report.
That's our mark. Yeah, we've got to change that. We've got to change that. I would like to think.
Well, as one of the major pieces, well, I'm stating the obvious, but maybe this is good for our audience, one of the major pieces that has to be dealt with is the appropriation for the next 2 years. And that touches all of our lives, both in terms of the impact on taxes that are drawn in and the spending that goes out on the other side. Has there been an effort this time to sort of coordinate the approach taken by the Senate and the House in looking at that whole budget process?
Part of those well, probably 80% of those 18 hours that we spent together the first several weeks were budget meetings. And we are still meeting regularly specifically on the budget. And I think that's, that speaks well of the coordination aspects that are happening right now.
Is that one of the big challenges facing legislators? Now, you notice I ask a lot of these things in the way of questions, but some of them are pretty leading questions. The folks who come around and they've got a wonderful idea or a wonderful project or a government service that they want to see expanded, and they can always make an objective case for that particular project, but when you add up all the projects that are good ideas, it may be 125% of the available funds. For instance, on school funding, the folks coming in saying, well, we should spend $5.1 billion for K through 12 in the next biennium. And of course, the governor has recommended $4.55 billion. And that's a substantial increase already over what's being spent in the current biennium. Yet some folks will just look at that and say, this is what we need, therefore you must spend it. How do you respond to folks about the other constituencies and all the other demands that have to be placed on you?
Yeah, that's, Kevin, that's such a great question. If we could get one thing out of this show, it might be this point. The money that you have to spend is in a box. There is no more money than what you take in. And you can discuss all you want whether that's too much, not enough, or just where it is. But we have so much revenue to spend. And the 90 legislators and the governor sit down and try and decide how to divide up that money from all of those really good programs. These 4,000 bills that we talk about, those are 4,000 really good ideas. You'll only pass a quarter of them because you just can't get to them all, and they are not quite as high priority. Same thing goes with the budget. Yeah, I've never met a bad idea in the budget, but this is all you have. So we get the big legislator bucks to divide that up the best way we can based upon our value system, our community's value system, and the state's value system. So when somebody comes in and says, I would like a program, and today was a good example. I met with a half hour from folks from home that want another $700 million that's already been allocated to other programs for K through 12. Great idea. You know, we could spend $10 billion for K through 12, and it would be twice as good as it is now. But I looked them in the eye and said, what don't you want us to do? And, you know, people won't do that, but we have to do that. That's what the Constitution makes us do, makes us balance the budget. So, yep, we're not saying it's a bad idea. We're saying it has to balance against every other thing that's going on. And that's not an easy task. It's not a pleasant task most of the time because we have to say no. And human beings don't like to say no.
Well, in fact, part of the challenge of dealing with this process is lack of understanding of some of these nuances. You mentioned the big bucks that legislators are paid, and of course I know you're saying that half sarcastically, or maybe just because the monthly salary for legislators is just over $1,200.
Yeah, I think it's $1,208 now, or $1,220.
Yeah, there's a big boost of $25 a month, and some folks think that legislators in Oregon are paid the way congressmen are paid, which is they get like $125,000 a year, but it's a little over $14,000 a year for our citizen legislators. And granted, there is per diem to cover daily expenses in session, but there's an example of some misunderstandings. And what you're pointing out is there's just a certain amount of resources, and unless we're raising taxes, the amount of resources that are available are limited. And for those who want us to reduce taxes, they've got to remember that that too reduces the resources available. Now, but spinning around on that, there is an effort to do something to reduce the tax burden for Oregon taxpayers. Can you talk a little bit about that, what's coming up?
You bet I can. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm a fiscal conservative. You know, just by genetic code, I'm convinced. My wife calls me cheap, but I prefer fiscal conservative. But look, we've been growing, the revenue has increased 14%, you know, this next 2-year period that we're talking about, 14%. If we kept government at exactly the same level of effort, all the services stayed exactly the same, all the programs stayed exactly the same, i.e. they got additional funding for increased caseload and inflation. So you'd walk into an agency and it would be exactly like it was 2 years ago. That's about a little over 9.5%. So over 5% is more revenue than it takes to do business as usual. It's about $500 million more. And I firmly believe that the government doesn't need that $500 million, or they don't need all of it. And that should go back to the taxpayer in the form of some type of tax refund. Reduced taxes, one-time tax refund, any number of different iterations. But the government is growing faster. Did you get a 14% raise the last 2 years, 7% a year? I didn't. Did you? Probably not, but the government did, and we're going to spend every penny of it because that's what governments do.
In fact,
which is very distressing. I stayed awake for the first 6 weeks of my first session, but that's what happens.
well, that's, in fact, one of the cues on that was if you're going to control the growth of government, the way you control it at the outset is by controlling the income flow. Once the income is in hand, it's very hard to control the outgo.
Yeah, I would, I don't say anything's impossible, but to date we haven't seen any results of it, be it Republicans or Democrats. If the money's there, then it's going to be spent some manner or fashion.
Well, in fact, there's always a felt need that will be felt even more if the money is there.
These are good ideas. I mean, these are really good programs. You really can't fault hardly any of them, but you just have to be able to say no. So quit sending us money.
Now, what are some of the other big issues that you might want to highlight that you see coming down during the rest of this session in terms of, can be social issues or management of resources, the salmon recovery plan? Anyway, what do you think of?
All of those things are on top of almost everybody's plate. Transportation issues, education funding, salmon plan, Measure 66, all of those things are high interest items for a large group of people. And we're trying to handle them. We're trying to handle them in a reasonable, responsible manner that reflects the value system of the majority party. And that's just what we're trying to do.
And in terms of working with the Democrats, have you found that working relationship to be smooth, rough? I'll let you characterize it.
Well, I find it to be excellent relationship. I sat right in front of the minority leader last session. I used to ask her for help and advice on many things. If she could vote one way, then I'd know not to vote that way. But I think some great people over there. We are going to have, out of these 800 or 900 bills that we pass, a couple of dozen of them that will be down party lines. Not that many if you stop to think about it, just a few percent. So by and large, the working relationship is good, will remain good. We'll have differences of opinions, differences of philosophy on a handful of measures.
But those are the ones that the media will focus on. They'll ignore the 95% of bills that go through pretty smoothly with general acquiescence and focus on those 5% that get into floor fights and tough vote counts.
So just quit watching the 6 o'clock news. Watch this report if you want to know what's happening.
There you go. Get the meat of the matter.
Get the truth.
Not just the spin. Well, we've only got about a minute and a half left. Is there any main theme that you want to see for the rest of this session as Majority Leader?
I'm looking for a smooth session, an effective session, one where we do what we need to get done and get out so I can go home. I really don't like this.
Well, that seems to be the Jeffersonian approach to government.
I think that's fine.
We heard a lot about that in other ways at
yeah.
the Legislative Assembly.
Yeah, he's a Democrat that we all can love.
Well, on that positive note, thanks for joining us on the show here today. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. We've had Representative Steve Harper from Klamath Falls, who is also the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, with us as our guest. And we hope you'll see us again next time. Take care in the meantime.